Hello. This is the Freethought Forum, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville called Ask, and the Rationalist Society of East Tennessee. I am Bill Calhoun, and I'm a professor emeritus in the psychology department for the University of Tennessee, and it's a pleasure for me to be here to share my thoughts with you tonight. Thank you.
I'm glad you're with us, Bill. See what we can do here. And I'm Joe Barnhart. I want to welcome you. I want you to remember, if you do or don't believe in a deity, you are welcome to this program because it's an open discussion for people who don't primarily believe in the supernatural, but it's also open for people who have other beliefs, and it's a show for people who are agnostics and atheists, skeptics, and of course everybody's a skeptic on some things. It's part of thinking. And so it's a program for people, sponsored by people rooted in science and that sort of thing.
Okay. We discuss various issues that are brought to us by viewers, and this is a call-in show, so please feel free to use your telephone. On today's show, the question that the visitors have asked us to discuss is, what is justice? And moreover, how do we develop a sense of what we think justice is?
Yeah, we've had some callers in on that one, and let's try to deal fairly with it.
The Atheist Society of Knoxville, just briefly mentioned this, it has a fun meet up at a bar or eatery, and tonight's meet is at Barley's Tap Room in the Old City, and it starts around 5:30.
Yeah.
If you go in the door, look for the silver-jacketed copy of the book, The God Delusion, which is standing upright on the table. And as Matt Dillahunty at Atheist Experience says, everyone is welcome to our happy hour for food, drink, and conversation. But if you plan to preach, proselytize, provoke, or even punch, please don't.
Yeah, don't provoke, but you can have provocative questions and comments. That would be useful. And the Rationalists of East Tennessee have several regular monthly meetings. The first and third Sunday mornings of the month are usually lectures and discussions, lively discussions. Second, we have meetings of the Skeptics Book Club. On the fourth Sundays, we are mixing up discussions and reflections and that sort of thing, and potluck. So look for this, and we'll try to get some more information later on.
If you have further interest in either the Atheist Society or the Rationalists of East Tennessee, later in the show we'll give you some websites to visit, and we'll give you some times and locations.
Now, our program today is justice and restoration, and we want to get into some depth in that if we can. What is justice, anyhow? How do you know when you have it, and why do we want it in the first place?
Normally, we're both academics, and we typically want to go back and reference somebody like Aristotle or Plato. And of course, Plato's going to be one of our first references. He thought about trying to bring harmony. And there are several kinds of approaches to the ideas of justice. Some of those are that come from a god or from a higher power, and they often come in the form of thou shalt not, meaning commandments or guidelines. There's a code of Hammurabi that predates Plato that had a whole list of things that people weren't to do, and so on. Other persons, like in this case John Locke, and also you'll find the Buddhists and the Taoists, all believe that there's a natural process of justice that is occurring, and the basic idea is to restore harmony or bring balance and in the Buddhist tradition, you've got yin and yang, and they are, we want to bring them into balance, the male and the female aspect of all of our personalities. And so justice is about trying to restore. That's why we talk about restoration. Restore a balance that's been broken by somebody's action and the like.
Yeah, get the yin, but not too far beyond the yang, and just get them in balance. And it's a call-in show, and so we want you to feel free to call in and share your ideas and disagreements. I mean, that's how we learn from each other, is sharing our disagreements and insights that maybe we hadn't had that you could contribute.
By the way, the phone number is very clearly there on the bottom of your screen. The area code's 865, and it's 215-2288. We're waiting for you to call. One of the things that I think that there are two things that I find very interesting in trying to discuss justice. One is we call our court system criminal justice. And there are even majors in many schools in criminal justice that are prepare a person to work in the criminal justice system, even becoming a policeman or a policewoman or in the sheriff or working with probationary and the like. Okay. We also have the situation where even the Pope recently said there may be a need for divorce to protect the children. So how do we bring harmony into a family where a husband and wife are in disharmony? This is part of idea of, can we bring justice into a divorce court, for example?
Yeah. And
most often we find that attorneys want to put the people into an adversarial situation. To bring about harmony and justice, we need to talk about how do we compromise. How can we help one person see the other point of view?
This
is really important, but we call it empathy. One of the really critical aspects, there's this book called Emotional Intelligence that made a big splash about 15 years ago, and of course it was designed to try to remind us that intelligence is not just a number like 128 on an IQ test. Intelligence is a lot more of that. But one of the major characteristics this author wrote about was empathy. How can I understand why what I'm doing hurts that person?
Would you say that's what divorce mediation is partly about?
I think divorce mediation attempts to get the adversarial situation out and to talk about, okay, are you really seriously about separating and leaving each other in this marriage? And especially if you have children. Now, what are the fair ways or just ways to divide assets, to divide items, and so on and so forth? Somebody was saying that she can have my mobile home, but I'm going to keep the tickets to the NASCAR races. Well, that's the sense of, is that just? Well, we don't know until we ask the people.
That's both sides,
Yeah, we need to listen to both sides. And often there are two sides. For example, in a case where someone in a family is injured or even murdered, the family sometimes, they say they want justice. Does that mean you want to go and kill the other person? Or you want to follow the Jewish law of an eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth? Well, some people think that brings justice. We have a societal system which is designed to kind of not let that happen by us taking action. We have an established procedure whereby the person will be arrested, accused of a crime, and brought before the, quote, halls of justice, and there the case will be heard between what we think learned attorneys and a learned judge, and presumably some form of justice will be
So that's
reached.
to distinguish restoration from revenge, I take it.
I think revenge is a sad thing. We know what we mean when we want revenge, but it never ends. That's the issue. Like in the old families that used to live up in the mountains here, they used to talk about the clans and the fights that got together. And if one clan lost a family member to a killing, then they had to go and kill one of the other clan. And this would go on for generation on generation. And at some times, these people would actually come together and say, this is stupid. This is really silly. we ought to stop this, rethink this, and understand that we can live in harmony. And that's, I think, what we really ought to mean about justice is how can we bring back into harmony that which has been moved from harmony.
One thing, in talking with you earlier, Bill, you mentioned that some had thought justice was isolation, put somebody in isolation.
Yeah, the criminal justice system basically approaches the idea of laws and law breaking with three different perspectives. And the first one, of course, is as a deterrent. We make laws and we publish them. For example, you see that law that says, buckle up, it's the law. It's to remind people to do things that we think, or the society thinks, is in our best interest. And we hope that by having a law, people will modify what they do. We all know that there are speed limits, and we know that we ought to try to obey those speed limits most of the time. I know the rule of thumb is 5 miles over the limit, it's going to be okay. But I know how often I've been on the interstate, and I'm appalled by these big trucks that are whizzing by me. The second aspect of the law and criminal justice is to bring people into a situation where they can be re-educated.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Now, hopefully, our prisons do that. Not very well, unfortunately. But the idea here is that a person can be brought in, and this is the kind of thing we talked about, brainwashing as if it's a bad thing. But if we have a person who is, say, committed a rape, wouldn't it make sense to have this person go into some kind of a group situation where people talk about things that they've done and why doing that is not it's just that you're really hurting that other person. Oh, some people say, oh, I'm sorry. Some men will say, oh, she liked it. Well, we know better than that. The biggest thing in rape, for example, is not the sexual aspect, but it's the power.
The power,
it's the power and control. And the woman feels totally impotent. She's given up herself. Young women who are sexually abused by their fathers sometimes end up as prostitutes because they have lost that sense of the value of their worth and so on.
Now, would you agree that sometimes there just cannot be justice? Sometimes the crime or the harm done, there is no real restoration.
I'm thinking about the Boston bomber that recently was sentenced to death by lethal injection. I don't know if that would ever bring about justice. I don't know if any of those people who were injured in that bombing incident could ever feel better about that. That's really bad. And the 9/11 thing, there's no way to restore justice there, because that was presumably a foreign country that was attacking the heart of America.
Yeah, if justice means to restore just the way it used to be, then it's not going to happen.
Rarely, there are cases where it just can't work.
Yeah, so you try to make a better situation so that it won't repeat.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's why maybe it would be better to put someone in prison rather than execute him if you say he's a murderer. Yeah. Is you don't want him free on the public.
Well, that's the third part of the criminal justice system. Besides trying to deter people from doing things or re-educating them, the third one is to isolate them. It used to be called that the psychiatrists were alienists. They were taking the people who are mentally ill out of society and putting them away because they were disturbing society. Well, there are people who are like serial killers. We want them out off the street. We want them in a jail that is secure. We don't want them able to come out and do it again. So in that case, the ultimate of isolation, of course, is the death penalty. But we have a lot of difficulty with dealing with the death penalty because, as you can imagine, people who are atheists and agnostics and free thinkers and rationalists will sit there and talk for hours about the death penalty and never reach a conclusion because there isn't a conclusion. The approach to this whole thing is that if I'm a super liberal, I'm going to tell you, if you execute one person who is innocent, then we should never have the death penalty. If you're a super conservative or eye for an eye, you're going to say, if you let one guilty person free, then we must have the death penalty. So you can't do any more than balance the two, because you're going to make mistakes.
Well,
no
at
matter
least
how
if
do
you
it.
imprison them, you haven't put them to death. And, I mean, it's not irrevocable. And then if you
Yes.
later happen to find evidence that they're innocent, it's not too late, at least to
That's for
to,
sure.
to release
Yeah,
them.
I do not personally favor the death penalty, because I do think the mistakes have been made, and
That's the strongest argument against it.
yeah, there's a group of people who went down into Texas, and attorneys and pro bono began to go through some of these cases, and they wrote a book called Adams versus Texas, and they found a number of cases where they were really not at all convinced that the person who had been executed was in fact guilty of the crime for which they were executed.
Yeah, a lot of revenge.
But lifetime incarceration is an alternative. But you think about an 18-year-old boy going to prison for life.
That's sad, yeah.
You wonder. Hopefully, there's some way to have that person be productive part of his life. I don't know how.
Well, you work at it.
Yeah,
but you have to have publicly observable evidence.
That's right. You've got to constantly keep. That's why you always, in any social system, you have to constantly check and balance and try to correct it, because you never get the final thing worked out. And that's the dilemma that the social scientists face all the time.
Yeah.
Is that you think, today we've really solved the problem of this, for example, race relations. And in the last year and a half to two, we've seen that race relations may be, quote, better in the United States now than they were 100 years ago. There are still problems. And maybe we've tried to cover them over with being, quote, politically correct. And being politically correct doesn't necessarily mean that I feel that way. I just am speaking that way.
Let me make a case for payback. See what you think. In some cases, if you steal something, you can pay it back.
I think so.
On the other hand, I want to argue this. You have violated the trust of people, and that's not so easy to pay back.
You can't get.
You can pay back the television you stole, but you have robbed people of a certain amount of trust. And so in some respects, we have to admit that there are only some areas in which payback works. In other areas, the community has to absorb it.
Yes.
And that's partly why I think what forgiveness means. It doesn't mean that you simply ignore the harm or that somehow you just slough it off. It means you don't have any option that's rational other than saying, let's try to restore this person, rather than ourselves turning into sadistic punishers.
You speak about payback. One of the simplest cases of that would be where some teenagers put graffiti on a school building, and they're caught, and you simply have them go and scrub it off, and publicly apologize to the teachers and the janitors and the principals, as well as the students, for having done that. They may have done it as a prank or so on, but again, that's a kind of payback. Or in case of someone robbing somebody, you can make restitution of the money that they've taken. And in the cases, there are some of these white-collar crimes where people have set up scams and taken, in some cases, thousands of dollars of people's money and used it incorrectly. You try to get some of the money back, and that's restitution and payback.
Ideally, would you say ideally, is it you would hope the person who does great harm to another can somewhere along the way learn to see that he has done harm and can identify with the person that he hurt. Now that's maybe the goal.
I think we hope so.
Now, in doing that, just to have punitive activity toward him is not going to bring this about.
No.
See, a lot of times these guys are, when they do these kinds of crimes, they're doing it out of revenge because they believe they have been ignored by society or they've been hurt or whatever. And somehow they have to learn they can't get away with doing what they're doing. On the other hand, they need to find some way to be treated like human beings, and they can learn to be accepted as persons, and they can get the joy of being appreciated as a person. I think some people haven't gotten to that stage yet, and they aren't lucky in that. But some people are luckier than others in having a good background to make that a possibility. And I think
that's it's a real dilemma for people in that mental health area, because we'd like to think that every human being can be mentally well, but the obvious answer is that that's not true. And there are certain people who are what we call paranoid, or in some cases paranoid schizophrenic, and they hear voices that tell them to do things, and those people are not retrainable as far as we can understand. And the sad thing is you can't do much about them in America, because we don't put them in jail without adequate cause. So then normally they have to harm somebody before we realize that they are going to harm somebody, and then we can try to deal with them. But
the schizophrenics you're talking about primarily.
Especially the schizophrenic, because they often will hear voices telling them to do certain things, and they say they're doing them because God told me, or Jesus told me, or the devil told me, or whatever it is. And they simply really are not responsible for what they do, and we can't sort those people out in advance, and that we have to live with it.
That in some ways, in hearing voices, these are a way of, here's a theory, is that all of us hear voices. Most of these voices are by people, real people outside us. In fact, if we went through life without hearing many of them anymore, we'd start having our own voices. Because people, once you get used to voices, you have to have voices. So putting people in solitary confinement is a way of inventing schizophrenia, it seems to me.
It can be. Certainly, it's not healthy for a person to be in isolation.
If you mean by schizophrenia, just the Greek word schizine, to split, split off from reality.
That's really what it is. Some people think it's a split personality. No, that's not what it is. It's
split off from reality.
Split from reality.
And total isolation is split off from reality. And that's not a way to restore anybody.
No.
You have to have others. You have to have a physical world to interact with. And
any case that we've come upon in the last years that have been recorded where a person has been raised in basically isolation, they do not develop normally, and they are not ever going to develop normally.
Well, nobody will.
Often. And we also really don't know what it means to be in a military war in terms of what kind of mental health issues arise. We do know from Vietnam that there are a lot of people who are suffering what we call post-traumatic stress syndrome, which means that they were put under a lot of stress at one time, and they're still feeling it, and they haven't really learned how to cope with it. And I don't know how to deal with that at all. Let's get back to the point, though. Justice is about trying to make things better. Trying to work toward a goal of what we call, in this case, harmony. In the case of the Buddhists, they talk about nirvana, which is a state of peace in the world, of peace with the world. You'll hear some people say, the world's not fair. Well, it's only a matter of your opinion or my opinion. The world is there, and my interpretation of the world is what's important to me.
You have to interpret it. If you're born, say, crippled severely, you can understand someone say, well,
surely.
It's not equal in that they get treated somewhat differently. But let's get back to something you brought up earlier, Bill, on brainwashing. Let me suggest this possibility, that all teaching is brainwashing. Now, let me qualify this. The danger of what we call brainwashing is what I call single-line brainwashing. In other words, it's a party line in one line. And I think education is basically, whether it's in the home or a church or in a community or in a university or wherever, a prison, Real education is multiple brainwashing. By multiple, means you have this intensive program, and then over here you have another intensive program, and it may have some differences. And so we learn early to get multiple points of view with certain intensity. And the better we are at that, then the better then we can look from one perspective to another.
Yes.
And that, in this sense, is what education is about.
No, you're correct. The term brainwashing really is a bad metaphor.
So I would even go so far as to say, therefore, there is no such thing as a neutral perspective. You can have multiple perspectives, and thus improve your original perspective.
Yes, I believe that's right. That the reason educators are often accused of being liberal is the fact that they do exactly what Joe said. They try to present alternative views. And that is really what education should be about, is trying to help people learn how to select among options and choose those that are most suited to what they wish to do. And yes, it is a form of, quote, brainwashing in the sense that you want to teach one set of principles, but don't imply that that's the only set that's understood. There are areas, we used to talk about theories of learning in psychology because there were competing theories of learning, and the answer is that they were all correct.
Well, one of the advantages of having multiple viewpoints is in the process, if you learn each one thoroughly, then you learn to have critical comparisons and critical analysis. And therefore you say, I don't swallow this whole hog, but I have learned it thoroughly. Otherwise, I can't disagree with it. And then I say, well, from this point of view, I've learned that if I hold to this, there's something wrong with this one. And you learn to make comparisons. And that's what I think good teaching should do.
Well, that's what we call teaching critical thinking in schools and colleges is the ideal in the liberal arts area, because you do want to teach multiple points of view, and you want to teach people to find their own answers. And,
now, could you do this in a prison system?
I hesitate to answer that because the prison system is so dictatorial and so rule-bound. I think you might be able to get a liberal type setting where you could do an experiment with trying to, for example, teach some people about empathy and about not harming others and the like. And that might be worth trying, and I think it has been done in some cases. But
well, empathy would develop if you can get inside another frame of reference and learn it thoroughly. And in other words, that's what empathy means, to get inside, wouldn't it? Now, it would seem to me that that would work in a prison system.
It could.
I mean, that's what some of these semi-sociopaths simply have never been able to do, is get inside the framework and say, well, look at this other person's point of view. You know, that he had to work for a living, or she had to work for a living, and now you want to go in there and rob them? And let's put yourself, now you're a worker. You've worked. Now, is this what you want happening to you? In other words, I think it's possible that some people, if they can learn to be thieves, they can learn to be good citizens. But it takes time to be a good thief. You have to learn it, and you have to take time to learn to be a good citizen.
Yeah, and then there's the other thing called the payoff matrix. That is that most people want to maximize the payoff, and for some people, stealing is easier than working, and you're not going to really change that payoff system, and that's where people get caught up in selling drugs. You go out in the street and you can make $100 or $200 in half an hour if you're selling little packets of heroin. You aren't thinking about the damage that drug is doing to the people who are buying it, and the fact that they are buying it means that they're supposed to be responsible for what they're doing. So it's really a complicated issue.
When is it, now you're a psychologist, when is it that a kid learns compassion? They're not born with compassion, I don't think.
A Swiss psychologist by the name of Piaget studied cognitive development in young people, and he said there are like 4 stages which they go through stages, and it would be in about the 3rd stage. Typically it's about high school, and in this case the peer group is so crucial.
That's crucial, yeah.
The values that people learn when they're in that it's the combination of being in high school and being 13, 14, 15, and the hormones are moving around, and you're beginning to realize that you're beginning to identify yourself as separate from others.
I remember in high school, Bill.
Yeah.
In high school with peer groups, I remember contending that some of my friends were cowards. And we got into, I said, you're afraid of compassion. You guys can't handle compassion. You're cowards. You don't have the guts to feel for another human being. That takes guts.
It does.
And you guys don't have it yet. But you can learn it. And that takes time, though, because the reason guys aren't fast on compassion sometimes is because we're on the defense. We got to protect ourselves, and that works against compassion.
Well, that's the major thinking in terms of a number of systems that are being developed in the Western culture, at least. And one of them was called A Course in Miracles, where they teach that the stage of the ego is important in the full development of the mature individual. But people get stuck in the ego stage, and there, you're right, the ego wants you to attack, to protect yourself, and egos tend to be paranoid.
And that's when the ego itself gets swallowed in its own self.
Yes.
Oh, good.
We have
got
a phone call.
Good. Go ahead, caller. Go.
Charles from Central Illinois.
Hi, Charles. Go.
The concept of justice and restitution, I believe it is.
Uh-huh.
Your stream is working fine. There are different societies, completely different levels of justice for the same crime.
Go.
So,
Can you develop that?
yes, there are places in the world today where a woman that is raped can be honor killed, versus here in the Republic of the United States where honor killing is not acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Now, whose honor is being dealt with here?
The family.
according to the concept of honor killing, it's either the family or the tribe. She dishonored them, or if she has an affair, or if she goes out with the wrong boy. Not too long ago, the situation was much the same in the United States with interracial marriage and interracial sex.
Yeah, I see.
We moved to a different stage of, I don't say better or worse or higher or anything like that, but a different stage of what is and isn't acceptable in that area.
Well, that's good to have multiple viewpoints on something like that, and you don't start off saying one's better than the other. You try to find out if you can learn from the other, and maybe each can be improved. I don't want to get up the notion that you can't improve, that all cultures are equally in every way. That makes no sense to me.
Yeah, but for instance, I don't accept the idea that you have to shun or kill the woman that was raped or had an affair or anything like that, because she impinged upon, quote, honor, unquote.
Right.
When you try to get them to define the concept of honor, you get it's a lot of double talk a lot of times.
Exactly. It's in other words, the moral unit there is more the family rather than the individual.
Yes.
And from their point of view, it's the family that was hurt, and the individual they make secondary. In our culture, it's certainly quite different. And cultures are important to protect, but they don't have feelings. People have feelings. That's a major difference. Well, thank you. You gave us a very good point on this, more than one. You have another point.
The recent spat of silliness going on all over the Republic of the United States on the freedom for religion against same-sex marriage. How they're always trying to defend the traditional one-man-woman marriage. When it just a cursory reading of the Bible demonstrates that it wasn't just always one man, one woman.
Let me ask you this. Can you give a good definition of what you think what marriage is? What do you think?
It is the society's accepted behavior between a man and a woman, or a man and a man, or a woman and a woman.
Okay.
For instance,
Give us the values involved in this.
trustworthiness.
Trustworthiness. Go ahead. Go ahead.
How much each person in the marriage is bringing to the marriage.
So responsibility.
Responsibilities. And given the wide variety of human interactions.
Would respect be one thing?
Oh, definitely. It would have to be.
Okay. Consideration? Would you make that?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
And Bob Heinlein's definition of love would be a big factor as far as I personally am concerned. And his definition was, when someone's happiness is as important to you as your happiness is, or I'm paraphrasing there.
So to be concerned about the happiness and the welfare and the security and the health of another person, that's love, you would say.
No, their happiness, their responsibility, and their consideration, and their so forth, are as important to you as yours is. Okay, it's a very deep-seated feeling.
Okay, now I could love another person. Now, whether I could love that person as much as I am concerned about my own happiness, that's asking a lot. But still, I could say to a degree, I could love another person. Am I making any sense to you?
Yes.
Okay.
But we're also discussing the concept of marriage.
Yeah. Now, that's I'm glad, because that's what I think marriage really is you have a real deep commitment of all of this trustworthiness and responsibility and respect, and it's so, in other words, it's more intense with that person than with anyone else.
Agreed, and it should work both ways.
I agree, yeah. Otherwise, it's not marriage. Ideally, it's not. It may be legally, but ideally, what we want from a marriage, it's not.
I concur on that.
Okay,
So,
and I think maybe a lot of people would concur. That's what most of us want from a good marriage, I think. And now my question is, could people who are not the same sex have that for each other?
I've known some that have.
Okay.
And I have found in my personal experience isn't all that wide, but there seem to be just about the same amount, percentage-wise, in the total number of the, quote, same-sex, gay, lesbian, and so forth, as there are in heterosexual marriage.
Yeah. Would you add devotion as a kind of commitment as part of marriage?
As long as it doesn't become obsessive.
Well, yeah, that's idolatry then, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I told my wife I don't want to be idolized. Because for one
I
thing,
couldn't live up to that.
well, I could not live up to it. And then also you need criticism, and the healthy criticism, because we all make some dumb statements at least.
I concur.
And then to have a good spouse is sometimes at least to say, are you sure you that's what you wanted to say? And that makes you think.
Yes.
And that's a positive thing, it seems to me. So in that sense, I think people who are same-sex might be able to have that too.
Yes. And marriages marriage ceremonies and so forth, one from a simple standing together in front of friends and family, pledging to love, honor, and cherish, to, the big hooplas of the gigantic marriages of state and so forth.
I'm glad you mentioned. And when Mary and I were going to get married, now that's, it wasn't 100 years ago, but a long time ago, the minister had in there love, honor, and obey in the rehearsal. And I said to him, I'm not marrying a child.
Or a dog.
Yeah, and he took it out, and Marianne didn't need to speak up, because, or she would have. But
yeah.
You don't want that in a marriage. I mean, you want to have mutual respect, and you yield to a good point of view, not to the other person just because they open their mouth.
Yeah.
But if they have a good point of view, you say, yeah, I yield because that makes good sense.
Okay, I'll let you go. You might have other callers.
Well, thank you, Charles. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Let me just go back to the point that he made.
Yeah.
And we need to emphasize that, and that is that there are very different definitions of justice in different cultures, and there are also very different definitions of marriage in different cultures.
Exactly.
And
yeah.
America would like to think of itself as being somewhat more progressive than perhaps some other countries, but there certainly are cases where the tribe, if a woman is sexually deflowered, as in rape, she is less valuable to the tribe. And the same thing is true if she has an affair. She loses value. So they want justice. And in the case of killing the woman that's raped is pretty brutal, I think that, but they would want to go out and try to find the person that did this and do that person damage. So we have to be careful and not use the standard of America.
Well,
culture.
it's like saying if a guy walked up and slugged another guy, then the guy who gets slugged dishonored you. I mean, that would make no sense. And it's the same thing to say if a woman gets raped, she had dishonored the.
Well, but though, if you go back to the high school situation, if a young male is in the hallway and another one comes up and slugs him, that young man's going to lose respect of the peers.
Now, the one that gets, I see what you mean.
So, there is an intent to get revenge. And that's why we have little fights out on the playground where somebody threatens somebody in time. In my high school, what they did was the two boys that were going to fight had to go outside across the street onto a vacant lot, and then they could go and they could fight. They couldn't do it on grounds. But one of my friends got an altercation with another boy over a basketball, and my friend was small. Probably weighed 120 pounds, and the other guy was tall, say 6'2", 6'3", probably weighed 200 pounds. And this wasn't a fair fight at all. But my friend went out there and stood up to him, and he had to eventually give up. But this is common in high schools, and they talk about bullying. We all got bullied in high school at one time.
Yeah, I remember.
And I just don't think we should make a great big deal out of it, but I do know that there are people who.
Now, how tall were you? Were you tall as a kid?
Now, I'm about the same height. When I was in high school, I was about 6.
Okay, I was very small as a kid, and I got bullied.
Sure.
And I learned quickly that you can deal with it. I remember I picked up a brick and hit the guy in the head. And, well, it was only a half brick. And he later became the center on the basketball team. And I remember as I had my hand on the second half of the brick, he said, "Don't do that." Now, he was a lot older than I am. I always admired him, though, because he could have taken out revenge toward me, but he didn't. Now, maybe the fact that my hand was on the brick had something to do with it, but he later turned out to be a very decent human being, and I'm glad I didn't do any serious damage with him.
Thinking of other cultures, in a number of the Native American tribes in this country, back in the days when they were still pretty much free, they would count coup. They would go to another tribe and attack them, but they weren't trying to kill them as much as they went up and hit them with a war club, just touched them. And they would call that counting coup. And that, again, was a way a man earned his spurs. And that's, again, a metaphor for the man learning how to ride a horse. You earn your spurs or whatever else is. Most every culture has certain kinds of rites of passage, and that's what high schools tend to reflect, is that the peer group and all the members in the peer group are going through searching for self-identity.
Self-identity.
Trying to feel good about themselves.
Would you agree part of self-identity is to find your identity within your community, within your group?
It's always within your group.
Where you're, and what,
I mean,
and
think about a town as big as New York City, how could you possibly find within your community? There are people like in San Francisco who have never been outside of their 8-block square area, but they have plenty of friends. It's almost always your peer group. And a peer group is an optimal size for a peer group. Kind of like in the military, they find there's an optimal size for it. They call a squad, about eight people. And something like 8 or 9 or 10, that's about how many you can kind of handle.
Kids do get bullied, even on school buses.
Oh yeah.
And I think adults have some responsibility in trying to help control this.
We all should be responsible to some extent. Although I'm not saying one about how to deal with that in the schools. I jokingly say that don't worry about juvenile delinquency. Eventually they'll grow up and then they'll be adults and they won't be juvenile delinquents anymore. That's a joke, but bullying will go away when they graduate from high school and go on. And I don't see bullying in the colleges that I've attended. And I've attended a community college and I've attended a very prestigious university. And you don't see that. It's a lot due to trying to find your way to make a mark for yourself, and often it was in my high school. It was small enough that most everybody who wanted to could play football, and that was the way a lot of young men, myself included, even though I was never any good, I went out for football, and I struggled to do that because it was something I wanted to do. I wanted to demonstrate that I could. I, in fact, joined the U.S. Navy and went through flight training, so I wanted to prove that I could fly airplanes off aircraft carriers, and I did. And then once I did it, that was enough. I became a college professor, and that's a lot more rewarding to me than flying airplanes off a carrier deck.
Well, there's more than one way to fly in life.
By the way, we're just down to about 10 minutes left, and we'd like to remind you that this is the Freethought Forum, and it's sponsored by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. This show is on most every Tuesday from 5 to 6 p.m. Eastern Time, and the Knoxville Community Television Channel is 12, but it'll be different depending on what outfit you have. I recently moved into a place where we have WOW, W-O-W, which used to be Knology, and it's on Channel 6, and I turned it on, and the picture is excellent. It's a very good program, and you get a nice, just like we see here, Joe and I looking at the screen over there that's showing us how we appear, and so on. So, and by the way, this is your out-of-town guests can get on this, and this is online. You can get us at CTVKNOX Community Television Knox.org O-R-G.
Okay. Well, let's move on to our topic some more. We've got some more things we got to come into. I'd want to suggest, see what you think, that in the Hebrew tradition, now this is ancient Hebrew, they had the Day of Atonement. Now, looking back, you'd say, well, this looks kind of ridiculous, but the job is to get inside another frame of reference and try to understand their point of view, it seems to me. And I think by bringing in a Day of Atonement, they sacrificed an animal. That was progress. Now, not maybe from the animal's point of view, but here you have tribal warfare and you read in the Bible a lot of tribal conflict.
Yeah.
A lot of it.
Well, there were tribes. There were 12 or 13.
And I'm having the conclusion that I worked out for a number of years is this animal sacrifice that they developed was substitutionary atonement.
Yes.
And then gradually they worked down to a very few animals because they had to learn slowly to respect the animals too.
Yeah.
And then they had one day for atonement. Just one animal, and that's major progress. Now we got a caller.
Hello?
Go ahead, caller. Go ahead.
How are we supposed to trust what you're saying when you got a jacket on that looks like that?
Speak up good and loud. I can't hear you.
Oh.
Well, I missed the point. What did he say? Oh, I'm sorry. Well, maybe I'll call back. Okay.
Yeah, picking up on what Joe said, we hear about a scapegoat. That's exactly what that was. That a group of a tribe would take a goat and whip it and beat it and kick it out of town, and that was sort of, again, the way that you got rid of your sins and your atonement. But I think that we all recognize animal sacrifice is very common in almost all of the earlier religions and cultures. And it wasn't always, they didn't just burn the animal. Often they actually ate the animal.
Oh,
So
yeah, they
food.
distributed the food
And
to each
the
other.
Aztecs did a lot of human sacrifice. The Celts also did human sacrifice. But we have come a long way. But the idea of the Day of Atonement is not unlike confession in the Catholic Church. We go back again to the early Jewish tradition. The men were the ones that were in the synagogue, and the rabbi was always a man. And the men would stand up one by one and say, I have sinned against my brother Joe, and I want to tell you that, Brother Joe, I'm sorry. Let's pick up the message.
Good. We've got a caller. Please go ahead from our caller. Give us a name and...
My name is Herb.
Herb, good.
I just want to touch on about the issue of extremism of macho men and weak women. It's versus the opposite of that. Wussy men and macho women. It's like the extremism is just that's what amazes me. They're always on the end. They're not part of the norm.
Well, you got a good point. Most of us have to learn growing up. You don't just slug back because you get slugged.
Right, and I mean I'm good with all of it, but the point is like that they're all extreme, and they know that too, and they like it.
Would you agree that maybe the word extreme means it's not, after a while, it's not very productive?
No, it makes no difference to me, but it's definitely not productive.
Yeah, it's we want something that's more fruitful and more practical. And
Right.
just getting physically even is not very practical. Because if you can slug one guy, his brother's going to slug you.
Exactly, and that's all I got to say. I just wanted to touch base with it's all good, but it took me a long time to understand what all good looked like.
It took a lot of us a long time. Thank you for
But, you know,
calling.
Y'all just figure out. You finished your show. I love it, man. Y'all are awesome.
Thank you for contributing. That's a good point. It's all of us have to learn the hard way sometimes, and part of growing up is saying, well, we've learned enough this hard way, and see if we can.
Well, that's one of the hardest things for parents, and that is you think that, oh, if I explain to my son about learning to drive, he'll be a good driver. And the truth is, no. I learned quickly with my older son. If I wanted to he and I both had motorcycles, and we also worked on cars. And those days you could actually change your own spark plugs and even change your own oil and things you just can't do on modern cars. But I would sort of do something and I'd go away, and then he would practice it without me there, and then he would get it so he could do it. But if I stayed there and said, no, don't do that, don't do this, do that, it would not work at all. And that was my mother's tactic, and it just doesn't work. You learn, as you say, the hard way, but no, it's trial and error, and that's how you learn the best.
It is, isn't it?
I was trying to learn how to fly in formation, and this is something that it doesn't take a lot of real work. But I had an instructor. We had 2 flights and then a 3rd check flight, and we were flying back-to-back flights because we were trying to save fuel. And I had an instructor that would not let me have the controls of the plane. I tried to move the stick and move the throttle and move the run. I couldn't. And I had to put up 2 flights with him. And of course, when I went up for my test flight, I didn't learn anything. And I tried to tell my instructors, I said, give me one decent instructor and one more flight, and I could pass it, and I did. Well, this instructor, I don't know who taught him how to be an instructor, but he wasn't. You don't teach by not allowing a person to experiment. And that's like you said, don't try to make me into an idol, because I'm not perfect. and one of my psychologist friends, and she's written widely, and I really appreciate, she says, if you're leading a group, remind them, I'm human. One day I'll come in and I have a cold, and don't expect me to be number one. I'm just one amongst all of you. And that's, I think, that probably is my final shot for you on justice is, as long as you understand you're one of many and they're all equal, you'll live in harmony.
I learned in teaching that, I remember once, I enjoyed discussions rather than lecturing. I hated lecturing because I didn't learn much. I already knew what I was going to say. But I remember I was in a class discussion, and some student came up and, in the middle of the class and made a point, and I said, I never thought of that. And he said, really? You're the professor? And I said, that's why I'm professor. And I said, I sometimes learn from my students. And that's the advantage of being a professor is I don't have to pay tuition. And he got the point, though, that it was an advantage to me to have a class discussion.
Yes, I think I've seen both kinds. I've seen faculty who will only teach from the lecture part and will not even take questions. And I've seen the other type, like Joe and myself, that we thrive on the questions because we know that we're learning. And also, often in a classroom, you got 100 kids, they don't all realize they're all scared. Yeah. Oh, I'm the only one that's scared. No, they're all scared. So someone raises their hand and say, I didn't understand what you just said. Would you repeat that? That's a helpful statement to me.
Because a lot of
let me go back and say it again. Because if you've ever been listening to a lecture where a person reads a paper, you can't follow them. If you're reading a book, you often stop. I just drifted off, had to go back and reread that paragraph.
I had a professor, Robert Tucker, who read his lectures word for word. Now, I'll have to say it was a wonderful class. Now, you would think that's ridiculous. In fact, the lecture was open for discussion, too.